The Black Death is the name given to a specific outbreak of plague that peaked in 14th century Europe and the Middle East between 1347 and 1353 CE. Plague itself is a rod-shaped bacterium called Yersinia pestis, a zoonotic disease usually circulating between rodents and fleas, but which can infect humans as well. There are in fact three main forms of plague that manifest in humans: Bubonic, Pneumonic, and Septicemic. Bubonic plague is the variant that very likely manifested in the Black Death, and the death tolls tend to agree. Modern bubonic plague is the least lethal of the three and has mortality rates between 30 and 75% if left untreated. Pneumonic plague follows, with mortality rates between 90 and 95% if untreated, and septicemic plague results in death in almost all cases without treatment. Fortunately, it is the least common of the three as well. Life cycles of Yersinia pestis, which we will refer to as the plague, is said to be either urban or sylvatic, with sylvatic being the scientific term for diseases affecting only wild animals. The sylvatic life cycle is of little consequence to humans directly, but it is known that the plague can spread from wild animals to domesticated rodents and back. Any infected animal can potentially spread plague to humans. People can spread the disease between themselves as well. Reservoir species are typically long-term hosts of given infectious diseases. The reservoirs commonly associated with the plague are several species of rodents, including marmots, black rats, and squirrels. It is known that certain members of rodent populations can become or are able to successfully resist the plague's typical destruction and can become carriers of the disease. Contrary to popular belief, the Black Death was not started by rats, but rather it was the fleas that infested rat populations. It could be truthfully stated that it were the rats who were the first victims of the plague in the 14th century. The life cycle of the plague has no actual beginning, but rather is a continuous cycle. Here we will begin with the plague as it infects a flea. A flea bites a rodent that is infected with the plague. The flea then consumes a number of the bacteria which multiply within. As the plague bacteria grow and grow, they become sticky and begin to cling to one another, eventually forming a plug which prevents food, in this case blood, from entering the flea's stomach. After the digestive blockage of the plague, the flea continues to feed, but to no avail. After each attempt to feed, the flea regurgitates the consumed blood, which is now infected with the bacteria, back into the host. As the flea begins to starve to death, they may jump from victim to victim in a vain attempt to stay alive. As a consequence, the plague is spread from host to host. The plague bacteria operate within mammals, such as rats and humans, differently than within fleas. As stated previously, plague within humans attack the body in three main manifestations: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. Bubonic plague is an infection of the lymphatic system. Once the bacteria is established in a human, they rapidly spread to the lymph nodes, where they begin to grow and divide. As the disease progresses, the lymph nodes can hemorrhage, becoming swollen and necrotic, which is the premature death of cells in living tissue. Bubonic plague is the least lethal variety, but can spread to the lungs or circulatory system, resulting in pneumonic or septicemic plague. The bacteria that remain in the lymphatic system will eventually reach a lymph node, where the plague will cause severe inflammation, causing the nodes to expand. This expansion is obvious in the characteristic bubo associated with the disease. Pneumonic plague is the bacteria Yersinia pestis that has invaded a host's lung tissue. It can be caused via two separate methods. First, it can be passed from the blood to lung tissue through a vector, in this case infected fleas. And second, pneumonic plague can be passed from person to person, which bubonic plague cannot. Among the signs and symptoms of pneumonic plague infection are fever, weakness, headache, and nausea. The most apparent symptom of this infection is coughing, often with blood. Along with the deadly plague bacteria, victims are often susceptible to pneumonia as well, which can result in respiratory failure and shock. Early treatment is essential in controlling this very aggressive disease and reducing the mortality rate, which is above 50% when left untreated. Antibiotics are fairly successful at reducing the plague's virulence and should be taken within 24 hours of the first signs of sickness. As bubonic plague invades and infects the lymphatic system, which ultimately drains into the bloodstream, it is possible for plague bacteria to enter the blood and travel to almost any part of the body. In septicemic plague, bacterial endotoxins cause disseminated intravascular coagulation, or DIC, causing tiny blood clots throughout the body. It can also cause tissue death due to a lack of circulation from the clotting. DIC eventually results in a depletion of the body's clotting ability, at which point bleeding is no longer controllable. As a result, there is bleeding into the skin and other organs, causing red or black rashes on the skin. Symptoms of septicemic plague include abdominal pain, uncontrolled bleeding, diarrhea, fever, reduced blood pressure, nausea, vomiting, and organ failure. Early treatment with antibiotics is enormously important and effective, dropping the mortality rate to between 4 and 15%. If left untreated, death is almost always the outcome. It should be noted that people with septicemic plague often die on the same day symptoms first appear. Now that we have briefly looked into the plague, which persists to this day, we will now turn to a specific place and time in which the plague arose to cause a horrible pandemic. The year is 1347, and the city of Kaffa is under a Mongol siege. Plague-infected corpses are hurled over the city walls, forcing traders to flee on their ships bound for ports such as Sicily and Venice. What the sailors don't know is that their rodent passengers carry fleas infected with one of the deadliest diseases known, the plague. To get a more complete picture on what happened in the Black Death, we need to go back several decades and look into the European world at that time. Towards the end of the 13th century, or between about 1280 and 1305 CE, Europe saw the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling, if not a true ice age. Regardless, harsh winters reduced harvests. Food shortages resulted in widespread malnutrition. High fertility rates that averaged 5 children per woman only increased the demand on food, resulting in arguably the worst famine in European history, reducing the population by more than 10% between 1315 and 1317 CE, 30 years before the Black Death. The plague that would strike Europe and the Middle East in the Black Death likely began as an epidemic in Yunnan, a province in southwest China. Estimates of the death toll in China dropped the population by about 50%, killing 60 million in the 1330s. From China, the plague moved west, by either the Silk Road, with Mongol armies and traders, or by sea. The reports of the disease reached seaports in Europe. India was depopulated, Tartary, Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia were covered with dead bodies. In 1347, the Mongols maintained the siege of Kaffa in the Crimea, though by then the plague had crippled the soldiers. Johnny Beg, a Mongolian Khan, ordered the corpses of the soldiers that had died of disease over the walls and into the city. the Genoese traders in the city fled for other Mediterranean ports, notably Sicily and later Venice. From these and other southern European ports, the plague took hold of Europe, and would not relent for the next 6 years. Genoese galleys from Caffa reached Sicily in October of 1347, where the plague rapidly swept throughout the island. 3 months later, flea-infested rats aboard ships made their way to Genoa and Venice, but it was the outbreak in Pisa in February 1348 that allowed the plague to travel into northern Italy. The disease would spread across all of mainland Europe, striking France, Spain, Portugal, and England, not later than June of 1348. The bacterium then traveled east across northern Europe, reaching Norway in 1349 and parts of Sweden the following year. The final portion of the plague's travels in the Black Death was into northwestern Russia in 1351, persisting for a further 2 years. The Middle East also saw the pandemic reach them as well, leading to serious depopulation that led to permanent social and economic structures. Around the same time the plague first reached Sicily, it was also transported via ships to Egypt, striking Alexandria in the autumn of 1347. It then traveled east into Gaza and then north along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, infecting those living in the cities of Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. By the end of 1348, the disease reached Antioch, whose residents fled north in panic, with most succumbing to the disease on the journey. The few who survived would introduce the deadly bacteria into Asia Minor. Some areas of Europe and the Middle East were left untouched by the deadly disease, notably the Kingdom of Poland. The level of medical knowledge in 14th century Europe was very limited and had stagnated. Due to the lack of scientific understanding of the time, superstitious explanations prevailed. The most authoritative contemporary account of the Black Death was in a report created by the medical faculty in Paris for the King of France. In the report, they blamed the heavens, a conjunction of 3 planets in 1345, which caused a great pestilence in the air. Because 14th century healers were unable to explain the cause of the plague, they turned to astrological forces, earthquakes, and the poisoning of wells by Jews. European leaders had no apparent response to the crisis due to ignorance of microorganisms like bacteria. Many people believed that only God's anger could produce such egregious suffering and death. As a consequence, and in vain with prior interactions with them, Jews in various parts of Europe were blamed by the Christian majority, resulting in the extermination of Jews in Mainz and Cologne, Germany, in August of 1349. By 1351, over 200 Jewish communities were destroyed. Another major factor in the spread of the plague was in the fact that personal hygiene was not remotely akin to modern hygiene. Bathing was a monthly occurrence, and usually occurred in public bathhouses. However, the religious leaders of that time frowned on public nudity, so commoners may have gone long periods between baths. Furthermore, filthy living conditions within villages and cities were common, and made a wonderful environment for the rodents who carried the plague-infected fleas. It was a condition created by humans that caused their own destruction. The death toll of the Black Death is unknown, and even rounded figures are hard to ascertain. The lowest accepted numbers are about 75 million people dead, while the high numbers could be up to 200 million. According to medieval historian Philip Delleder in 2007, the trend of recent research is pointing to a figure more like 45% to 50% of the European population dying during a 4-year period. There is a fair amount of geographic variation. In Mediterranean Europe, areas such as Italy, the south of France, and Spain, where plague ran for about 4 years consecutively, it was probably closer to 75% to 80% of the population. In Germany and England, it was probably closer to 20%. In the Middle East, the population was reduced by about 40%. The Black Death was the deadliest outbreak of plague ever recorded in Europe, but it wasn't the only occurrence. Following the Black Death outbreak, plague appears to be present somewhere in Europe for the next 3 centuries, with the last outbreak in Europe occurring from 1664 through 1667 CE. For example, over 1 million people in France alone died of plague in the epidemic of 1628 to 1632. Today we call the pandemic of the 14th century the Black Death. Those who lived through the plague called it either the Great Pestilence or the Great Plague. It would be 2 centuries afterwards that the events were described as black by Swedish and Danish writers, who likely intended to use the term black due to the gloom and dread of the disease, and not because of the blackening of skin in those who suffered with plague. From 1944 through 1993, 362 cases of human plague were reported in the United States. 90% of the cases occurred in 4 western states: Arizona, California, Colorado, and New Mexico. Plague has been used as a military biological weapon for many centuries. Accounts from ancient China and medieval Europe show that various groups such as the Huns, Mongols, and Turks have used infected humans and animal carcasses to contaminate enemy water supplies. As stated earlier, the Mongols hurled contaminated corpses to infect their enemy at Kaffa. During World War II, the Japanese army formed a special group of scientists, doctors, and soldiers into what was called Unit 731, located in northeast China. Unit 731 personnel committed some of the greatest atrocities of the war, including the deliberate infection of mostly Chinese prisoners of war, who were injected with the plague bacterium and later studied, including the vivisection of human beings while still conscious. At the conclusion of the Second World War, United States and Soviet Union scientists began to develop means of weaponizing pneumonic plague. Experiments included various delivery methods and developing strains resistant to antibiotics and combining the bacterium with other diseases such as diphtheria. The stockpile of biological weapons that involve plague in the U.S. and Russia today are unknown. As the plague is treatable with antibiotics, a widespread pandemic is unlikely in developed countries. They died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnola di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world.